I've got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not right up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is good too, Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Taylor, and I'll be one of your hosts, and joining me in just a few seconds will be Tanner. But first and most important, let's shout out some new patrons. Riot Ferret, Rare Scrungle Springus, Daniel, and Hides. Thank you so much for signing up. We appreciate it. We hope you enjoy the content. And if you're out there listening and you're wondering what that content is, it's usually like a deeper dive into, may not be directly shipwreck related, but tangentially, or looking at a certain time in history and maritime history. Sometimes it's a movie. It's just a fun way for us to spread our horizon a little bit and get a little more silly with it sometimes. But also it's a fun way to dive into some pretty serious topics as well. So with that, I'll bring in Tanner. Tanner, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm here and I'm excited and I'm ready to go. Wilkie is sleeping next to me.
I love his pictures every time you post them.
Everything I need here.
He's a photogenic little fella.
In the right light. Black cats are really hard to photograph. Which I've heard, anecdotally is one reason they don't get adopted as much. I don't know if that holds water, but they are kind of hard to photograph. You need the right light so you can actually see. Although it is kind of funny when you just take a picture and it's just a shadow with eyes.
I do love his green eyes.
He's right here. I've got the biggest crane fly I've ever seen in my window to my left here.
What's a crane fly?
A crane fly is those big... a lot of people mistake them for very, very large mosquitoes.
Oh, okay. I think I know what you're talking about.
They're big, spindly. They do look like a really big mosquito, but they're not. They're different.
Is that just because you live by a lake?
Yeah, we have a lot of those. We have a lot of lake-related flies because we're like a quarter mile from Lake Winnebago.
Okay.
So yeah, a lot of midge, those types of things. I've mentioned, some of the books I've been reading and stuff recently. I've been paying a lot more attention to, insects and small wildlife around us. It really is amazing how much is going on just in your backyard.
Mm-hmm.
We like to sit out in the yard and read, and there's a couple little anthills I sort of check on. A lot of cool stuff happens. You don't have to go somewhere exotic to see cool stuff happen. It's cool to pay attention to those things if you're really looking for the small stuff.
Yeah, that is cool. To actually, I imagine understanding and knowing more about that stuff makes it a little less uncomfortable when you see gross bugs and stuff because it's more interesting.
You do kind of tend to focus on oh, this is amazing. I'm taking you could technically call it a course. It's more just something for fun through Clemson University. They're extended online programs. I'm taking a course called Entomology for the Naturalist. It's taught by a Clemson professor. It's all video. It's all asynchronous. So it's purely, basically when you want to do it, you get a certificate at the end when you complete it. But it's been really great because he kind of goes through different major families or different major orders of insects. And, he's got his videos. He's going outside showing you where can you find these things? How can you identify these things? It's very focused on the practical applications of entomology, hence the name of the course. It's less concerned with the fine little details of, species to species, but focuses more on identifying things based on order. So when you're just out, in the park, in your yard, identifying things, it's really cool. It's been a fun experience.
It's cool to get something out of those little courses like that.
That's part of my media check-in, I guess.
Yeah, roll into it. What else you got going on?
I'm reading a book called Apogee of Empire.
Okay.
Spain and New Spain in the Age of Charles III, 1759 to 1789. It's by Stanley and Barbara Stein. And it's a look at the world of the Spanish Empire in the mid to late 18th century. So at a time when Spain is, in hindsight, we could look at it and say is clearly on the decline. But Spain is attempting to hold on to their status as one of these dominant world powers, one of these colonial powers, in the face, of course, of Britain as the increasingly dominant world power. And so it's an interesting time. This is Bourbon Spain. This has been, the Bourbons have been in charge of Spain for about 50 years at this point. There's still a lot of holdovers from the late Habsburg Spanish rulers. And so a lot of, problems still to be fixed. And so it's an interesting time. Like there's reforms and some modernization at certain levels, but then there's also a lot of conservative reestablishment or attempts at reestablishing, direct government control over parts of the Spanish colonial world. So it's a really interesting time. It's kind of the precursor time to a lot of those Latin American revolutions from the early 1800s. We discussed part of that in the San Pedro de Alcántara episode back in season 2, a bit of Bourbon Spain, but it's very detailed. It's dense, but it's a good, interesting read.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. That is an interesting time. Like you said, like the empire is not what it was, and it's beginning its slow descent, but kind of just watching what goes on in government and the reactionary bits and also the reforming bits and all that.
Yeah, the Spanish Empire is interesting in that like it doesn't really lose territory in the same way that like other empires sort of fall apart externally. It sort of kind of rots on the inside and just weakens internally until it starts to lose everything and kind of, blow after blow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting process to read about.
Nice.
How about you? What are you up to?
I started playing a new game called Out of the Park Baseball 27. If you're a baseball fan and you don't actually want to sit there and play through the game like on MLB The Show, this is probably something you'd be interested in. It's basically a GM / coaching simulator. So you don't directly control the players, but you manage the game. You track player development. You control promotion and demotion for like A, AA, AAA rosters. You do all the drafting, all the roster management and stuff like that.
Isn't there like a FIFA manager game?
Yeah, I think those games back in the day kind of started this trend, and now they have it for everything. But this is cool because it has all the real players in it. And you can also go back to like, you could start your season in 1900 if you want.
Oh, no.
And play like dead ball era baseball and stuff like that. Like, it's very interesting. I find myself getting bored playing the games sometimes when you actually have to like, play 9 innings of baseball or whatever. Or same as college football. At the end of the day, like my favorite part of the college football games is always the recruiting, right, and roster management. So this game like just lets you do that for the most part. Like you simulate most of the games, or you at least like quick simulate it and kind of watch over it. But at the end of the day, like you're just controlling the roster, and it's pretty fun. A lot of statistics, a lot of spreadsheets, but
those are interesting because it sort of highlights like the fact that people like baseball for different reasons, and people like sports for different reasons, and it sort of locking in on a different aspect of sports fandom is cool.
Yeah, it really is, and it's kind of a fun way to like game out different scenarios in a season. Like, what if this guy suffers a season-ending injury in, May? Like, how does that affect this team? Like, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see how everything can play out and how players develop. Other than that, we started Better Call Saul. We're into season 2 of that. It's excellent as I expected. I like that it's similar to Breaking Bad. Like, you can definitely tell it happens in that universe, but it also still has its own vibes and feels. Like it's definitely its own show, which is cool.
I have seen probably 30 to 40% of Better Call Saul not in sequential order.
Okay.
Because Katie watched it, and she really liked it, and I caught some of it then. And then I liked Breaking Bad, but I just never really sat down to watch Better Call Saul.
Yeah, that's kind of how we were, and we just decided like, oh, we need a new show to watch, so that's the one we picked, and it's been good. I've really enjoyed it.
We're on Mad Men right now. We are about to finish season 2 of Mad Men. We love it.
Okay, that's one that's like on our list at some point for sure. Obviously, like all these shows have been off forever, but I don't like watching shows when they're not completed. Yeah, because I don't want to invest like 4 seasons of something and then have the ending either totally be unsatisfying or not happen if it just gets canceled. Like I want to know if I'm starting an adventure that I get a complete closure.
You don't want Pete Campbell becoming king of Westeros. Also, I guess media related, I think I mentioned on our last episode, I guested on We Always Lie to Strangers, actually twice recently. One was that Ozarks themed quiz show, and then the following week I was back on there to talk about an illicit paddlefish caviar ring in the Ozarks. So both of those are great episodes. Go check those out. Our buddies over at We Always Lie to Strangers, we'll have them back on our show at some point soon. We'll find something to discuss with them.
I feel like we could find like a riverboat or something. I feel like a good swampy riverboat disaster.
Actually, something. What is it? Is it the Arabia? I think was one we discussed doing as kind of a crossover. So things to look forward to.
Cool. I guess let's get into it. Speaking of looking forward to things, let's talk about a shipwreck or a disaster or some mixture of those things.
A ship or two ships, I guess, will get wrecked.
Yeah, this is really a 2-for-1, I guess, actually.
There will be wreckage.
All right, well, let's get into it. First, have you heard of Port Chicago?
Well, now I have.
Yeah, obviously now, right?
And even before that, I know because I think you had first mentioned it when we were discussing something about the Pacific War. And I had never heard of it at that point. I think you were the first person to mention it.
Probably I'm blanking on the name. What is the Pearl Harbor?
Oh, the West Lock disaster.
Which I believe that happened just before this one, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't remember the timing.
Anyway, Port Chicago is a town in California. Port Chicago itself is situated on Sassoon Bay, which is an estuary of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. All of this is part of the large tidal estuary system that flows to the San Francisco Bay. Port Chicago itself is located about 40 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge, to put that into perspective. I think people, when they think about San Francisco Bay and how big it is, but it's so much bigger than you even really realize.
Yeah, there's that whole like river system that goes inland. I don't really know much about California inland at all, especially Northern California.
It's very interesting, like that, there's deep water ports in places like Sacramento and stuff like that. Like you don't think of that as being a thing, really. But this whole tidal estuary system is massive, and it's a huge part of California's economy. A lot of the places you think of around the Bay Area, like they're all situated on water, and they're all super far away. Like San Quentin, for example, is a great example that, like, it's miles from San Francisco, but it's right there on the water. Just this whole system of bays and everything is really vital to the California and the larger American economy, which means during wartime, it's going to become one of our main shipping points. But first, let's talk about Port Chicago itself. The first white settlers entered the area in the 1850s. There's actually a freight shipping dock built in the area. There's a smelter for the Copper King Smelting Company, which was built on the site. And at the time, this place is actually referred to as Seal Bluff. Must have been a lot of seals there.
Well, I mean, if you go to San Francisco today.
Keep that one Congress lady away from the seals.
Marie Reichenstoltz Perez.
So this facility would close February 15th, 1903. In 1907, the land is sold to C.A. Smith, and he establishes a warehouse and a factory related to his Minnesota-based timber business. One thing that might not be as obvious today, but in this area of California, there were a ton of trees. Oakland is called Oakland because of all the oak trees.
I was going to say, they're cutting down those. Are they cutting down? Are these the guys who cut down the redwoods also, or is that earlier?
This is all part of it. The conservation was not on their mind at the time.
I know that like business brain is a powerful thing, and if you're a lumber magnate and you see a redwood tree, you're probably just seeing dollar signs, but it's just like, I don't know, as a human, if you've ever stood next to one of those, the idea of cutting it down is just like painful to think about.
I think there's two ways of looking at it, of like, wow, that's a big tree, it's beautiful, and like it's awesome, or whoa, that's a big tree, I wonder if I can cut that down and make money out of it.
And I think maybe wider knowledge of like life and natural history and like how long a tree like this takes to get to this size is maybe part of that too. But it's one of those where it's like on the cynical side, yes, you obviously understand, oh, that's a lot of money if you're in the lumber business, but yeah, that's crazy.
So yeah, lumber is a huge business in this area at that time. That leads to some of the development of some of these settlements. The settlement would grow throughout 1907 and 1908. There's several residences established there, a general merchandise store. And at this point, the town is named Bay Point after the Bay Point Land Company. So a lot of these land companies are just trying to develop different things. I know there's a lot of mining going on in the region, obviously the lumber business. But fortunately, what's about to happen? World War I. More economic opportunity.
Thank God.
During World War I, the Pacific Coast Shipbuilding Company established a shipyard to aid the war effort. The nearby town of Clyde is actually built to house the workers that'll be working at the shipyard. If you look at a map today, you'll see Port Chicago, and just south of there, you'll see a little town called Clyde. Today, Port Chicago is a ghost town, technically. When you look around the area today, you do see like there's refineries, there's still a lot of shipping going on. This is still a very like industrialized area.
Okay, I see Clyde on the map here too. Oh yeah, Honker Bay is right outside
Bay.
Port Chicago there. They also have a Pittsburgh.
It's spelled funny, isn't it?
It's spelled without the H.
In 1931, during the depths of the Great Depression, a local business leader by the name of Walter Van Winkle proposed to change the name of the town to Port Chicago. His idea was this would attract more attention because Chicago is a big city in Illinois.
Is this just like a Greenland situation?
Pretty much. He's like, I want to attract people here. They'll see Chicago and stay here.
They'll think they're going to the real one.
Yeah, they'll think they're in Chicago. It's very interesting. I mean, I guess it makes it pop out on a map a little bit. You're like, oh, Chicago, why is it called that? So as time goes on, a military munitions station is established in Port Chicago, mainly because of how convenient it is to ship stuff there or from there. It's also relatively isolated. It's close to San Francisco, Oakland, all these big industrial areas where you're producing a lot of stuff. But you're also not trying to load all these bombs and mortars and depth charges in downtown Oakland.
In the Robert Allen book on this, he mentions, some of the officers, they like live in Oakland and they, basically commute to the base. So it's like close enough that you could do that, but obviously isolated enough that hopefully if there's a big explosion, it doesn't,
You're not destroying like 8 blocks of Oakland. And it's also amazing what you can do with a real rail network. You're able to move this stuff from where it's produced to a consolidation point. I'm
American. What is a railroad?
Wait till you hear about passenger railroad, which is probably what allowed those officers to live in Oakland and commute in. The town itself is located about a mile from Port Chicago Naval Magazine. This would later expand to the Concord Naval Weapons Station.
Concord is a very funny thing to have a naval weapons station named after.
Plans were made to establish the magazine in the immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attacks. It's pretty clear after that, we got to get the logistics machine up and running. Truly the reason we win World War II. Logistics.
And God.
And Stalin taking advantage.
And Stalin. That's who I mean.
Taking advantage of our good logistics. I will always contend, people always say people say America won it or the Russians won it. The Russians were given so much aid by Lend-Lease to let them do their thing.
The Russians also spent millions of lives. The Soviets, rather.
They needed both.
I would venture to say it was teamwork. I think the Soviets would win the war regardless, but I think it takes them a good bit longer to do it without.
So many more. Yeah, so many more dead Soviets.
But ultimately, it is the Red Army who flies their banners over the shattered ruins of the Nazi capital.
This is true. I played that mission on Call of Duty.
I do think it's funny when people use the term Stalinist as an insult. It's like, yes, compare me to the guy who made Hitler kill himself.
All right, so the need for another ammunition transshipping terminal in the San Francisco area was something that was known before Pearl Harbor. They knew that they needed to increase their logistics capacity in the area, that the Pacific was going to be a theater of war that would happen at some point, not necessarily in 1941.
I think these Japanese are up to no good.
Yeah, that's pretty much what they said. So there was already the idea that they needed to develop some of these munition sites. Captain Milton Davis was the port director at Mare Island. He wrote to the 12th District's commandant in July 1941 of Port Chicago's site potential for filling this role.
The site was used during the last war as a shipyard, and several shipping board steamers were constructed there. It has rail connections with the Southern Pacific, Santa Fe, and Western Pacific railroads. The trackage has deteriorated due to lack of use and will have to be replaced or repaired extensively. 2 ship berths alongside are also considered necessary. There's plenty of land suitable for an assembly plant or storage plant should such development be in order. The great value of this site lies in its complete isolation from habitation and industrial activity.
Yeah, so right there you can see the main draw is it has rail connections that are established. They might need to be repaired, but that's fine. We can fix rail track. It's also in the middle of nowhere, so if you blow something up, it's only so bad.
You're only going to kill some sailors.
And what if we put some sailors we didn't really care about there?
Right.
But we'll get to that part.
Also, I remember reading in the Allen book also about how there were some issues because it was originally planned to have capacity to load 2 ships at once, but just based on, I don't know, the scheduling, whatever, they ended up having to initially design it where only 1 ship could be loaded at one time. And later it is expanded so that they can load 2 at once, like we see in our story here. But that was one of the issues initially was the kind of bottleneck on the capacity of the actual loading process.
The first ship was loaded almost a year to the day after Pearl Harbor on December 8th, 1942. Well, that was kind of interesting. The munitions that moved through this terminal included bombs, torpedoes, artillery shells, small arms, pretty much anything you were trying to use to blow up the enemy or shoot the enemy is moving through here. I mean, it kind of makes sense to keep your munitions supply chain separate from, say, your medical or your food or whatever. You're not mixing all this together. The explosives stay with the explosives. Another important thing to remember here is this is pre-standardized container. So you're not just throwing this in a box and putting it on deck or in a storage hold.
I imagine Malcolm McLean was probably like a young man at this point.
This is a lot of hard and physical work, moving thousands of pounds of explosives.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the men who did this job.
Because it is such hard work, I think it would be best to probably distribute this out so that everyone has to do the work equally.
Yeah, sure. That's what we think in 1941 America. Just kidding. A majority of the enlisted men working at Port Chicago were African American. These men had been trained for actual jobs on board vessels. They were not instructed on how to load ammunition and were expected to learn on the job. These are not men who had gone through specialized training. They had gone through training of how to serve on an active Navy ship at war, not how to load ammunition on a dock. How might they have selected these people? Well, while training at the Naval Station Great Lakes in the real Chicago area, the top 30 to 40% of recruits would be selected for non-labor jobs, i.e., they would be the ones that would actually do the things they were training for. The rest, the bottom 60-ish% of the class, would serve at Port Chicago doing manual labor.
And at this point, I think this is probably about when this is starting to change. But at this point, even if you're serving on a ship as a black sailor, you're largely constricted to like steward type positions, right?
What's his name? Is it Dory Miller?
Dory Miller.
Yeah, like, I mean, he's a cook. So even, yeah, like, I mean, it's not like you have it great even as you're, serving on board a ship, but you're at least doing the job that someone on that ship has to do. You're a real sailor. You have your, action station that you report to, things like that. Like you're at least treated with the respect of a real sailor.
Matching somewhat at least the concept of, when you signed up, or I know a lot of these guys didn't really have a choice of what branch they were going into. But, if you did actually have a chance to choose the Navy, you're at least doing something akin to what you're thinking of when you join the Navy.
Yeah, you never know when you're going to go from slicing potatoes to having to do some under siege shit. For some Northern recruits, this would be the first experience they had with formalized Jim Crow. We kind of talked about this a little bit before. Like, neither one of us are under any illusion that the urban North is any utopia for African Americans, and this time it's not. There's plenty of institutionalized racism, but like you said, to have it spelled out and signed out in front of you in this way is new to some of these guys.
It's also an interesting time from a non-war perspective, looking at, this is, in the middle of, what we later termed the Great Migration, that starts around World War I, where you have millions of Black Americans from the South, moving to these big cities on the East Coast, the Midwest, the West Coast. And so like the demographics of those cities are changing. That's where you get stuff like the Harlem Renaissance comes out of that. So it's an interesting time for the country culturally that way. And so like that stuff all going on as well in the midst of this, wartime situation. So it's like there's a lot of cool things. And we'll talk more about this in part 2. I have some stuff I want to cover where you have this sort of concept where like Black Americans are essentially fighting a two-front war in wanting to, help out with the big war effort, but also acknowledging the fact that back home, these ideals they're fighting for aren't real. There's a hollowness to what they're sort of fighting for when they go overseas and fight for democracy and come home and don't experience that.
Yeah, and some of that's even pointed out in like some of the German propaganda that gets used in World War II of like, why fight against us in Europe when you don't even have rights at home?
It's a huge vulnerability from a propaganda perspective. So you're saying the Nazis kind of had a
so you're pro-Nazi.
record scratch moment.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting time in American history. There's a lot of change happening in these moments, and a lot of it, being eventually brought about by World War II of Black men and white men serving together that would have never interacted otherwise, and breaking down, some of that discrimination or reinforcing it in other cases. Like, it definitely cut both ways,
as we'll see more in part 2.
So in the book, The Port Chicago Mutiny, Robert L. Allen includes an account from Percy Robinson. He's an enlisted man at Port Chicago who trained at Great Lakes Naval Station.
This is where I first ran into discrimination. When we went to eat, they had a big white house out there where we went. There was 2 lines. Obviously, you stood in one line because all your friends was in this line. So you look around there, and there's another line over there that's all white. They were going to eat upstairs on the main floor. All the blacks were going downstairs. It dawned on me that these people were discriminating against me. You see, I grew up in the Black Belt of Chicago, where I wasn't affected by it as much. This is my first experience of racial prejudice in the Navy.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. He almost like doesn't realize it's happening until it happens. And you're like, wait a second.
And kind of like we said before, it's like at this, 1940s America isn't a utopia of racial equality anywhere. But like there is a qualitative difference in, experiencing discrimination on an interpersonal level. That's always going to be an obstacle here. And seeing it written down, seeing a sign that says whites only. It's interesting to think at this point how, there are people who have not experienced that. There are Black Americans who, just because of, where they grew up, if they grew up in an urban area in the North, Chicago as an example here, obviously they've experienced, discrimination at some level, but like, this is different. This is a different beast. This is, this is kind of the boogeyman of Jim Crow sort of reaching his hand north somewhere that it's, it's quote unquote not supposed to be.
Yeah, it is very different. So as we're talking about, they're only taking the bottom half essentially of these graduating classes at Great Lakes Naval Station. And this would lead to a lack of competent low-level non-commissioned officers at Port Chicago. Because if you're only bringing in the people who are troublemakers or, unwilling to do a job or not good at it, you've got no one to promote. You got no internal leadership, essentially. Which means you're essentially going to have an us versus them with the officers. I think that's like something people don't think about, but like a strong NCO Corps is one of the things that has made the American military unique, I think, in the annals of history, in that the enlisted men are a little more empowered in the American Army than in other armies. This problem is made worse by the occasional draft of men with good service records for other jobs. People die in war, and you have to replace them. So if you've, say you were in the bottom of your class, but you've worked well at this job for 6 months, they're going to be like, oh, well, maybe we can work with him, promote him out. And then you become, a cook's assistant on a vessel, actually, rather than working at Port Chicago. Basically, Port Chicago is where you put all the ones that can't do anything else. And as soon as you can show you can do something else, they pull you out of there.
Yeah, which is like not...
It's not how you build a cohesive...
Yeah, it's not a system for success, necessarily.
Officers at Port Chicago look down upon the enlisted men. Tell me if you've heard any of these descriptors before, calling them unreliable, emotional, and lacking the capacity to understand orders. The enlisted personnel were directly led by black petty officers, who the enlisted thought of as weak and ineffective at voicing their concerns to those above.
I will say, like, to draw I think to a more modern and maybe more widely experienced perspective, some of the descriptors of these, the men who were here at Port Chicago, these largely black enlisted men, a lot of those descriptors, you could draw a sort of an analogy to how you see this described in sports today.
Mm-hmm.
A white player who is very visibly emotional is, described as, fiery, whereas like a black player, a non-white player exhibiting those same sorts of behaviors is often described as, out of control.
Selfish,
can't control his emotions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not to make everything a race thing, but I mean, just recently we saw Abner Uribe for the Brewers. He did his triple crotch chop towards the Cardinals dugout. He gets this, 1 game suspension. Pete Crow Armstrong told a White Sox fan to suck my fucking dick, bitch. And just got a fine. So, like, I don't know. Those aren't totally comparable situations, but like, yeah, you do see a little bit of disparity in terms of how those things would be treated.
Anyone that's watched wrestling knows what he was doing.
And he's doing it to his fellow competitors on the field. Free my boy, Abner Uribe. He did nothing wrong.
Free Abner.
It's the Cardinals. Fuck them.
So it's not uncommon for these enlisted men to refer to the petty officers as slave drivers or Uncle Toms. Which, I mean, I can see it. I mean, they have some level of authority over you. They're not making your life better, easier, or safer. They're also probably doing less physical work than you because they're in charge. And I mean, when you're oppressing a people, it is always good to have something to divide them, right?
You definitely understand the sentiment. Obviously, as a white person, I'm not touching the term Uncle Tom with a 10-foot pole. Not my job to decide who that's applied to. But coming from like the more analytical perspective, you can see where that would come from, where that sentiment would arise of feeling like they've divided us into this, like you said, this us versus them scenario.
And now we're mad at each other instead of them, so it's harder for us to organize for better conditions.
Have a special like 500 level tier that's like, this will reveal the list of black people that Taylor and Tanner think are Uncle Toms.
Captain Merrill T. Kinney was the commander of Port Chicago when the events we're going to discuss today took place. He was previously a naval officer from 1915 to 1922. Recommissioning in 1941, he was assigned to a general cargo ship. Prior to his time at Port Chicago, Kinney did not have any special training in the loading or handling of munitions. Obviously, this is early on in World War II. We're scrambling to fill positions and get people in places where they can, use their talents. And I would imagine something like this. Kinney looks like he's probably an older guy. This isn't like a frontline assignment. You just want to stick someone in there that can probably do the paperwork involved.
And free up maybe a younger guy
to go do something a little more demanding.
To go die off of Guadalcanal.
Yeah, like on a destroyer somewhere. Well, the officers serving under him had only received brief training while posted at Mare Island Navy Yard. Mare Island is not far from Port Chicago.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing that the Port Chicago is basically like a sub-command of
Mare Island.
Mare Island.
Yeah, and Mare Island is also not an actual island. But it is, Mare Island is off of San Pablo Bay, so it's a little bit closer to San Francisco and all that. Vallejo is actually right there by Mare Island. A lot of the Zodiac stuff kind of happened in this area. The Zodiac Killer, I should say.
A lot of the general stuff to do with astrology happened in this area.
When Kinney took command in April of 1944, the loading officers had been operating under orders set by Captain Nelson Goss, commander of Mare Island Navy Yard. So like you said, Port Chicago is like technically like a subunit of Mare Island.
And that earlier thing we read about the description of the site of Port Chicago, I believe, if I remember correctly, that was written by the commandant of Mare Island at the time. Mm-hmm. So he was looking at how could we expand this station.
So the standard that was supposed to be achieved as far as loading goes is 10 short tons per hatch per hour. And since you're loading these Liberty ships for the most part, it's all pretty standardized. There's the same number of hatches on every vessel. There's the same space to load into. So you can, keep some pretty decent metrics on this stuff.
Mm-hmm. One of the upsides of the SS we built this yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. Kinney kept a chalkboard with each 100-man crew's hourly productivity. Junior officers would regularly bet on their crews and push them to work as quickly as possible, often to the detriment of safety.
The Brendan Sorsby method.
It's not like safety was number one to begin with, so I can imagine they're pushing it even more when they start tossing some money on the line. This is sort of like the COVID death pools that the Amazon warehouse managers did, I feel like. Remember that story?
Kind of, but it kind of just got folded into all the other Amazon abuses. I wouldn't have been able to pick that one out specifically.
So these pools are known about by the enlisted men. And, I don't think they're necessarily like offended by it, but it was very much like a talk of like they bet on us like we're racehorses. But also they had it did probably encourage them. I'm sure their shift was better if their officers won some money. So I feel like they probably had a little incentive too to keep those above them happy.
You could have done like a pizza party or something.
Maybe hey guys, could have if we win this week, pizza Monday. Mm-hmm. Everyone gets one slice.
There's other ways to encourage productivity.
The men in general, though, were aware enough that when senior leadership was around, they did slow down and use a little more caution and work more safely. So when Mare Island comes to visit, you got to do things right.
It's like when I worked at Target unloading the truck. It's like the one night where our team lead was like, okay, tonight they're reviewing the video for the truck. So we're going to actually, follow the safety rules.
And it probably took you so much longer than normal. In 1944, Port Chicago averaged 8.2 short tons per hatch per hour, while the professional stevedores at Mare Island loaded 8.7 tons per hatch per hour.
I don't know if this comes up later, but maybe this is a preview for part 2. Those professional stevedores at Mare Island are also unionized.
Interesting. I figured they probably were at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting is they're only a half a ton behind them.
Mm-hmm.
And they are not professional and not unionized. It's very interesting that how well they were actually able to do. And maybe some of that's shortcutting safety regs. I don't know.
But that is one thing that comes up in terms of why are these stevedores used here and not here? And one of those reasons ends up being, well, we don't have to treat or pay or train or really care about these guys as much.
It's the same reason they send the National Guard to fix any problem you can ever think of. Is it's like because they can't say no and they have to just go do it. Training for officers and enlisted was pretty much limited with regards to loading and unloading munitions at Port Chicago. There were 2 formal lectures and several informal lectures that were given by officers to the enlisted. There was no follow-up beyond these lectures and no checks to see if the knowledge was retained. They didn't have to do their yearly safety videos, brush up on your skills.
No quizzes or anything?
No, I have to do a hazmat thing every year, and it's so annoying. But
it probably helps. You know your hazmat stuff.
I do. Official safety regulations were only posted at a single location on the pier. Kenny did not think the enlisted could understand the posted safety regulations. So he didn't post them anywhere but one place because he didn't think they could read them anyway. If you kind of want to know where the attitude of the officers towards the enlisted.
Right.
The International Longshore and Warehouse Union became aware of these unsafe conditions, and they actually offered to help train the men. However, this offer is declined by the Navy as they feared it would lead to higher costs, slower pace, and the possibility of sabotage from civilian workers.
And they don't want them talking to unionized people because they don't want them asking questions about, well, how much do you make?
Right.
What are the conditions like over there?
Lieutenant Commander Alexander Holman, loading officer, was responsible for the officer training. He attempted to acquire training materials, but unfortunately, tragedy would strike first. Holman would later write,
"Some time ago, I had discussed with Captain Kinney about starting a class for the training of officers. Lieutenant Woodland was agreed upon as being a good officer for this purpose. I had told him to look around and see what samples, charts, diagrams, books, and other things he might get to instruct officers in ammunition, explosives, things like that. But so far, that had never, up to the time of the explosion, reached a head."
So, handling of munitions. Obviously, the men working the docks were not oblivious to the dangers they faced. They're told that larger ordnance was not active and could not explode since it didn't have fuses and would be armed once they were in the theater of operation, which is largely true. They're not primed and ready to go, but if something exploded, they would explode with it.
Right.
They're still very dangerous to move.
They might not start the explosion,
but they'll help finish.
But they can be exploded.
Moving larger munitions was basically a process of using levers and crowbars to move them from rail cars and then pack them tightly in dunnage. Then they would be lifted and rolled along the pier and packed into nets, which hung over the side of the vessel, which would then be winched up. These munitions would then be lowered into the hold and dropped into place individually. This is a very physical process. Imagine some of these big 2,000-pound bombs and torpedoes. You're trying to bump this thing along and winch it up. This is a very grueling process for sure.
It is kind of funny though, also with these how tough and how grueling and how long this takes to load each one of these bombs individually, and then how quickly those bombs will be used.
Mm-hmm.
It takes no time at all to drop, a cluster of these things. I mean, it's kind of like war today. It's each of these drones and these smart guided missiles is a highly technical process that costs millions and millions of dollars. And, we go through them like nothing.
It is pretty amazing.
Mostly on civilians.
So throughout this process, it's not uncommon that shells are damaged. Obviously, with this much physical labor going into it, sometimes it's going to happen.
The end of it, loading one of those up on a plane out in the Pacific, you just getting one that has a dent in it would suck.
It's like Kansas soup. Can I get a discount on this one? All right, so let's discuss a little bit more about the loading. Some vessels were equipped with a powered winch to speed up loading a little bit. So now instead of men having to lift these things by hand, they can be winched up in the net and moved to the hold that it needs to go to. This leads us to the star of our show today, the E.A. Bryan. Bryan's a Liberty ship built in 1944. As with all Liberty ships, she's 441 feet long, 57-foot beam. In total, 2,710 Liberty ships are built, and there's actually still 3 in existence today, 2 as operational museums and 1 as a static display. I've actually been on board one of these, the Jeremiah O'Brien, which is moored in San Francisco Bay. It's probably about 35 miles away from Port Chicago, actually. It was a really cool trip. It was interesting seeing, like what that was like, and what, this vessel that we built so many of these things to have so few left. It was pretty cool to get in there and see it. Absolutely terrifying engine room. I can't imagine being in there.
A good example of how something that's pretty, relatively speaking, mundane for its time, just by virtue of surviving, becomes a really unique part of history. These ships that were not really designed for long-term survival, the fact that any of them are still around is kind of a cool bit of history.
Yeah, it was very cool. It was very cool. It's definitely something I'm grateful that I got a chance to experience that and see it's a little bit of history, actually. So back to the winches. These winches endured a lot of stress from day-to-day operation. One of the primary safety devices on these winches were the brakes, which would stop them from failing if power was ever lost. Experienced operators would routinely bypass the brakes, as this tended to slow them down. This disuse would sometimes cause brakes to seize up and become inoperable. Although only 5 months old, the steam-powered winches on board the vessel were starting to show some signs of wear.
I know in the Allen, I think it's Joe Small, who will be a major character in part 2, who's talking about operating these things and how, I think he says, a real winchman never touched the brake. If you knew what you were doing, this is not something you had to use.
Yeah, that was definitely the attitude.
Which could, anyone who's worked in kind of a warehouse type environment, that can sort of start to reinforce itself. The idea that, well, if I use this, I'm not a real operator of this thing, so I can't use it. Maybe even in a situation where I need to.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that kind of think in these type of positions. So in an incident on July 13th, 1944, the A. Bryan's number 1 winch brake was found to be stuck in the off position. This meant that the winch would operate freely, but had no ability to stop if steam power was lost. So not necessarily safe. The chief mate and engineer would examine the winch, but it was not clear if it was made operational. Remember that winch. July 15th, during loading, the number 2 winch began to make a hammering sound. This is remedied by applying grease to dampen the noise until a main bearing could be replaced the next morning. So again, another winch problem, but this one is successfully identified and remedied. This brings us to July 17th. A bleeder valve on the number 4 winch required repair. A civilian plumber by the name of Albert Carr from nearby Pittsburgh, California, was called out to replace it. This was his first day at Port Chicago. Carr would fix the issue, but was struck by how unsafe the loading activity going on around him was. He saw a naval artillery shell fall 2 feet onto the wooden pier and braced for detonation. However, there wasn't one. So here you see even civilian people who have no training in this are something doesn't seem safe here.
Yeah, I mean, seeing a crew drop a bomb onto the ground and assume you're going to die is probably a situation here where it's if it had happened, you wouldn't have had time to recognize it, probably.
Yeah, well, like, we'll see what happens, because
Yeah.
we're going to do the thing here soon.
Yeah, we don't actually have to theorize about this.
This brings us to the incident. So we're going to backtrack back to July 13th, which we just talked about some of the winch issues they've been having. It's 8:15 in the morning. The EA Bryan is docked on the inboard or landward side of the pier. Like we talked about in the beginning, it's like there's two slips basically on this pier where you can load vessels, essentially. And she's on the side that's like the inner side.
Yeah, it sticks off kind of like parallel to the shoreline, where you could get two ships there.
Yeah, so for her, it is like land, ship, pier, and then the next ship would be pier, ship, water, essentially. She's not carrying any cargo, but she does have a full load of bunker fuel, heavy sea bunker fuel, that is. That fuel's not overly flammable, I don't believe. It's more like a diesel. Like, you really have to try to light it. By 10 o'clock that morning, loading has commenced, and this will proceed for 4 days, with about 4,600 tons of munitions being loaded. At 2,200 on July 17th, there were 98 men actively working to load the vessel. Let's talk about what was being loaded. We have 1,000-pound bombs in hold number 3, fragmentation cluster bombs into hold number 4, and 40mm shells in hold number 5. That leaves us with holds 1 and 2. Hold 1 was receiving incendiary bombs, which were handled with extra care, and they're actually loaded one by one. Each one is a 650-pound bomb with a live fuse installed. I'm not sure why. I don't know what the reason is for these have to be armed, but apparently they do. As you recall, hold number 1 is the one that we mentioned with a possibly faulty winch earlier. They never did say if they actually fixed it or not, just that they looked at it. We looked at it. Hold number 2 is being loaded with a new airborne deployed depth charge, the Mark 47. These weapons are armed with 252 pounds of Torpex. Torpex is about 50% more powerful than TNT, but for our purposes, it's also much more sensitive to external shocks and dents. Want your winches working with these.
Is that a function of it being a depth charge? And
I think it's a function of the Torpex being more reactive.
Right, but I mean, like, is that also something that would be desirable in a depth charge because you want it to explode? Like, you want the most explosion for your buck, basically, in that scenario. Right. Because if you do hit a sea mine or you do happen to land a torpedo hit, you want to try to, take down that vessel. Actually have it explode. In total, there were 16 rail cars being unloaded on 3 parallel spurs near the dock. The rail cars held about 430 short tons of explosives, and in total, the munitions on the pier and in the hold of the Bryan were equivalent to 5,000 short tons of TNT. On the opposite side of the pier, parallel to the Bryan, was another Liberty ship, the newly built SS, is it Quinault Victory? I've been saying Quinault in my head, kind of like Esquimalt. On the opposite side of the pier, parallel to the Bryan, was another Liberty ship, the newly built SS Quinault Victory, launched in May 1944. Also, I was going to point out, I don't know if this is a subset of Liberty ships, but Quinault Victory is technically a victory ship. So like a victory ship is like the next, right? It's like the next evolution. Iteration. I know, yeah. But I feel like someone's gonna yell at us in the comments. Probably and be like, so yeah, a victory ship. Like I think the victory ship is honestly not that different than like the Marine Electric, and even as far as like the Alfaro is not that different. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that is like the second generation. Okay. Of Liberty ship. A little bigger, a little faster. The vessel was being prepared by a 102-man crew
to begin loading explosives around midnight. The vessel did have a partial load of fuel oil that she had taken on the previous day, and some of this fuel was capable of releasing flammable vapors. So a little bit of that hazmat training here. Vapors are what actually explode. Like
right.
when you have an explosion like this around flammable stuff, the vapor is the dangerous part when it comes to sparking. At this time, there were 67 officers and crew at their stations on board the two ships. So obviously, all of the crew isn't necessarily there. Their port. Maybe there's some people that are on leave, but you still have to have some people on board the vessel supervising the loading and just maintaining the basic systems of the ship. Additionally, there's various support personnel around as well. There's a 3-man civilian train crew with a Marine sentry. There's 9 naval officers and 29 armed guards in the area, along with a Coast Guard fire barge that had a 5-man crew. And that's actually docked at the pier as well. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of activity going on here. A lot of people doing a lot of things.
Do we know how close this fire barge is to the... It's docked at the same pier as these two vessels?
Yeah, because neither one of these vessels takes up like the entire length of the pier.
Okay.
So they're just down at one side. But they are very, very close to the actual vessels.
So is it potentially a situation where you can be too close to the disaster?
Yes. You are the disaster at that point. It's noted by an officer who left the pier area a little bit before 2200 that the Quinault Victory's propeller was slowly turning, and that the men loading the Bryan were struggling pulling munitions from rail cars because they were so tightly packed. So it's interesting that the Quinault Victory's propeller is spinning, which means their engine room's doing something. But it's also interesting that he notes how much the loading crew is struggling with the munitions. Definitely a concerning scenario.
There's something more about that we'll include in part 2 about given the situation, certain loading things being basically pushed past their limits in terms of how much is being loaded on each load on the winch.
At 2218, multiple witnesses reported a noise described as a metallic sound and rending timbers. The sound you would expect to hear from a falling bomb. There was an immediate explosion on the pier, followed by quickly spreading fire. Only 6 seconds after the initial explosion, a more powerful explosion rocked the pier. This explosion resulted in nearly every munition in the EA Bryan detonating at once. The fireball could be seen for miles, with Army Air Force pilots in the area reporting a 3-mile wide fireball in the sky. Glowing red chunks of steel were tossed 12,000 feet into the air and would come to rest miles from the original explosion site. The A. Bryan was completely destroyed, while the Quinault Victory was blown out of the water and torn into multiple sections. The largest section, the stern, would land upside down about 5,000 feet away from where she was moored at the time of the incident.
Is it 500 feet?
Yeah, 500 feet. What did I say?
5,000?
Oh, yes.
Believable.
Yeah. 500 is still impressive. Yes, 500 feet away from where she was moored. The Coast Guard vessel that was also moored at the pier was thrown 600 feet upriver where she would eventually sink. So you're saying like the force required to throw a vessel
2 football fields?
Feet. Yeah. The pier and basically everything on it were literally blown to pieces. This includes the locomotive, the railroad track, and the men who were unfortunate enough to be there. I'm saying about the force it takes to basically vaporize a locomotive, especially like a big steam locomotive.
Yeah,
like, that's a lot of force, a lot of pressure.
Well, and I know that there's a good map in the Allen book about the how the tracks are laid out here. That each of the cars are basically rolled out to be unloaded in like I think basically like 1 or 2 at a time, And the ones that aren't being actively unloaded are basically in these like sheltered, I think they're called brevetments, where they're protected from presumably something like this. But
yeah, it's very interesting, that process that they go through there. But yeah, the revetments, you're right. They would store the empties after they were unloaded there. Rail cars not on the pier, but waiting to be unloaded in the staging areas were bent and twisted, with some of them thrown completely off the rails. Seismographs at UC Berkeley detected 2 shock waves and established that the larger one was equivalent to 3.4 on the Richter scale.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's pretty big for like a man-made thing. Glass, metal, concrete, and unexploded ordnance began to rain down in the immediate aftermath. This would cause further injury to both civilian and naval personnel. Fortunately, there's no recorded additional deaths from any of this material coming down. In total, there was almost $10 million worth of damage to government property, but a far greater tragedy are the lives lost. With the fires contained, the grim task of cleaning up loomed ahead. Bodies and body parts were strewn in every direction. Of the 320 men killed in the incident, only 51 would ever be identified. Those uninjured by the blast volunteered to clean up and rebuild the site. It's kind of crazy that that's what happened. Like how quickly it's just like, okay, well, we still got a war on. Like, time to repair it and get it back into service. And then the thing we'll close with today that I think will lead us into your part next week. A statistic that I read when doing this research that really stood out to me is that in this incident, a total of 202 African American men were killed, while another 233 were injured. This accounts for 15% of all African American casualties in World War II.
That is a crazy statistic that this is all just one incident. And granted, like, most of these people aren't serving in frontline combat positions, but still, a lot of them are, in dangerous situations serving on ships in the Pacific, for example. Yeah, like that is the crazy thing about this this disaster is those casualty numbers.
Yeah, just how disproportionate they are. That like 15% of all African American casualties come from this one incident that was very avoidable, probably. So yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to leave it today. We've talked about the actual disaster. I mean, there really isn't a lot to the disaster itself in the sense, other than the sense that, like, it all went boom at once. But I think more importantly is like, talking about why this disaster happened and the factors around it and why it affects one group so disproportionately are far more interesting.
Yeah, and we'll get much more into that in part 2, where we will talk about what is referred to as the Port Chicago Mutiny.
I think this will be a pretty good spot to wrap it up for this one. We still have so much more to get into in part 2. I'm looking forward to doing that episode. Yeah, looking forward to it. Awesome. Well, I hope everybody has a great week. Thank you for listening. Check out the Patreon. Shoot us a message on Instagram. Do whatever. But thank you for listening. We appreciate it.